refreshment. So there'll be a drinks reception following the talk, and then you're on your own for dinner. And Ursula here says just go east, and you'll find lots of places to eat at if you do that, or you can use Yelp or Happy Cow or any of these apps to find out where to eat. It's a huge pleasure to have Stephen M. Watt as our closing speaker for this day's proceedings. And I just met him yesterday, but he's a great guy to have drinks with. So he's responsible for actually many breakthroughs. The Axiom computer algebra system, the Aldor programming language, Maple. He's actually one of the founders of MapleSoft, and currently he's Dean of Mathematics at the University of Waterloo, and so it's a really distinguished position and a very distinguished university. And the initiative that he's going to describe is actually one that I think is really central to the formalization of mathematics.
So, well, thank you very much for the overly generous introduction. I have to say that, so first of all, I'm only responsible for parts of some of those things. And secondly, my main area is computer algebra. That's where I've been working most of the time. However, I do recognize formalized mathematics when I see it, to the extent that I can say that I have no formal proof that I am not Ursula Martin. All right. So the schedule here, there has been a transposition. If you look in different places expecting to see Ursula Martin, then you will see her, but she won't be speaking. All right. So I'll talk about a few things today. The first will be to go back and take a look at this long-time dream for the notion of something that has been variously called a global digital math library. We'll ask, what is a global digital math library? We'll talk about how that might relate to formalized mathematics, and whether the older ambitions were ambitious enough, even though we haven't really completed them. Maybe we ought to strive for more. Then I'll talk a little bit about this International Mathematical Knowledge Trust that's been set up to address some of these challenges and some of the seed projects in it. All right, so this idea of a global digital math library has been a long-term goal of many people. It's conceived initially as having been like a comprehensive online repository of linked articles. That was the vision, say, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And it had been formally endorsed by the International Mathematical Union. The early vision was to just digitize a whole bunch of journals, like to do a comprehensive digitization of all the mathematics that has ever been, research mathematics has ever been published, and then to do optical character recognition on the scanned pages, and then to insert cross-links for the various different papers that refer to each other and perhaps things within the papers. And of course, already we're seeing that this is a little bit of a dated vision because, of course, now most of mathematics is born digital, and every year the fraction that is that would need to be scanned is less and less. More and more of it is scanned, but maybe the things that are referenced the most are actually some of the older works. That's something that's very interesting about mathematics and different from many areas of investigation. Can you imagine in organic chemistry that you would be referring to a paper 100 years old as a relevant research result? Very unlikely. All right, so we don't need to read this. This is just to show that on August 20th, 2006, the General Assembly of the International Mathematical Union endorsed this notion of a digital mathematics library and its vision for the future. Now, we're not going to read all the way through this, but I will point out a couple of things, and let me make sure I've got the right button here. There we go. And it says it should include a substantial part of the past literature. Most importantly, the components should be connected both to each other and the current literature. It can begin most easily by focusing on journals. The ultimate goal is to create an enduring network of digital literature, most of which can seamlessly be traversed by all scientists engaged in mathematical research and scholarship. I think that's something that most of us here can see as being desirable. And then it goes on to some specifics about having accurate metadata, consistent with agreed upon standards, to have lists of references linking to index databases and so on. High quality. Now here we're getting high quality scanned image for each page, and text derived from OCR, normally hidden, but for searching. So this was a vision about 10 years ago, 10, 11, 12 years ago, and it goes on. All right. So the draft was written in March of 2005. So that's a dozen years ago. Then Philippe Tondeur, former director of the National Science Foundation in the United States, he was going around and promoting this at various places. Here are some slides from his talk at an IMA workshop in 2006. What was the current status of things then? All right, so he goes and he talks about the goal of at this point it was the World Digital Math Library. It wasn't global, it was the world. He talks about certain people who were involved in initiating this inspiring to move in this direction. And he presented a little bit of an inventory. And so we've got a point and we've got a derivative, and so we can see where things are now. So he estimated that there were about 2,300 journals and periodical publications, many of which are no longer publishing. Identified 2 million items, articles, since 1868, with about 80,000 additional items per year. So if we extrapolate that, well, maybe we have, I don't know, maybe 3,000 journals that we need to think about now, maybe about 3 million items identified since 1868. By comparison, there are only about 1,500 monographs per year. And so we'll come back later to the discussion about journals versus monographs. All right, and so he had cited a number of benefits. Bringing together this enduring math legacy for researchers worldwide, making math knowledge available to progress. These aren't his exact words, but to propel applications that use mathematics, so that we're not always going back and having to rediscover the same things, how they fit together, and so on and so forth. Basically, as a power tool for getting things done. Making large body of mathematics freely available. There was a lot of talk about paywalls and how the majority of published mathematics is inaccessible. The majority of the world does not have access to published mathematics. So that was one element of consideration. The increased use of historical materials, less duplication, and so on and so forth. But basically to accelerate the process of doing mathematics. This is to be an element of this. And so he recognized already back in 12 years ago, and as did anybody who really thought about this, that there were many issues. For example, what should be included? Exactly what things, should we just have referee journals? What about the archive? What about preprints? What about monographs and so on? How to include it? Should we be including PDFs? If so, what versions? Scanned images? If so, what kind? Sources for documents, and if so, exactly what, and so on and so forth. The ever-present issue of copyright for most of the articles, and most of the people in this room give away copyrights when they submit papers to conferences. One retains or to journals, one retains the right to publish them on one's webpage usually, but to be able to have access to sort of great collections of things, there are copyright issues that are to be dealt with. Interoperability between various different databases, and sustainability about the whole effort. In the meantime, we made considerable progress. So, for example, Project Euclid, now to Cornell, the European Digital Math Library effort with the back files of many journals completely scanned. JSTOR, which had mathematical journals up to a certain point. Various different professional societies, and then there's the publishers with the article collections behind paywalls. So somehow it's a rarity these days when we actually have to transport our physical body to the library to actually look at an article. And to a certain extent, articles that we're reaching this Jurassic boundary where articles that aren't online don't exist almost. So we might not have all of the organization that we had anticipated in a global digital math library, but we see all of the ice flows are coming together, that the big parts are there. All right. So then, since this had been endorsed by the IMU, then Ingrid Delbeschies in 2014 brought together a group of individuals to discuss, well, exactly where are we on getting this thing done? So this is just an email that arrived in my inbox in the 23rd, this is an American software program, the 23rd of July, 2014. And you'll see that some of the names of the people here you might recognize. And basically it was an invitation for a 2-hour meeting to discuss where we were at the Global Digital Math Library at that time. And so it says sort of what you'd expect it to say. So can you please come and have a chat and see whether we can do something useful and actually sort of get things done. So that's what that email says. At the end of that process, we ended up with there were a group of about 20 people there, decided that a subgroup should get together and actually sort of chart a course and take the first steps. And so here we have some members of this group present in the room today. And so in particular we have Michael Kolhaza and Patrick Ion, as well as myself here. I don't believe that Terry Bush is here. So, all right, so if anybody is here who I haven't called out, please do come and say hello. All right. So the idea, so what was this working group supposed to do? It was charged with designing a roadmap, next steps, and so on and so forth, prioritizing different requirements for implementation, estimating budgets, fostering the writing of proposals to funding organizations. So this is what the group was supposed to be doing. And we've had a number of activities with this group. A session at the joint math meetings in the United States last year. Fields workshop on semantic capture languages. So once you somehow harvest the information that's in this collection in this literature, how do you actually represent it? And I know that folks in this room here will have some definite opinions about how one might be. There might be a plurality of opinions about how one might represent such knowledge. And believe me, there are more opinions out there of how one might want to represent this knowledge. And we've had a number of specific presentations and discussions with individuals and presentations at conferences. And we have also founded a not-for-profit organization with the blessing and indeed the encouragement of the International Mathematical Union. This organization is the International Mathematical Knowledge Trust. It's a not-for-profit recently incorporated in Canada. There was some question as to where to incorporate it. It's a big world. There are lots of jurisdictions. It has to be incorporated somewhere. And one of the messages that we got, I apologize to the Americans here, one of the messages we got was not the United States, because if it was going to be a global digital math library, there would need to be a strong awareness of what was going on in other countries. So that was... we had no political insight at the time. All right, so the short-term goals then for this not-for-profit were outreach on the whole global digital math library idea, to form some seed projects and to have some coordination with our colleagues to help have more things happen more quickly. With the long-term goal of making available, and here I'm going to start to get a little bit hysterical and say to make availability the, quote, totality of mathematical knowledge in digital form, employing human and machine usable knowledge tools. And so that's one shouldn't think small, especially in one's long-term goals. And so this seemed to be a long-term goal that we were not at risk of achieving too quickly. All right. So we came back then to discuss what is a digital math library. We might start off by saying, well, it is exactly that. It's a collection of PDFs. We're done. Goodbye. Here's a nice index. Click your heart's content. We thought that was not really what we ought to be doing. So there's, of course, all the document collection aspects, but then there is the notion of knowledge capture from individual documents. Now, one can do this by hand, as has been done in many projects, many of which are represented in this room and many of which aren't. One can do this in various different automated or semi-automated way depending on the precision of the knowledge, what one means by knowledge representation at this point. Another goal then for a digital math library would be integrating this knowledge that's in all the individual articles into some kind of a coherent knowledge base where I have not yet defined these terms, but those terms will mean what they need to mean in order to do something sensible. And then to have tools to sort of query this base, this knowledge base, to use it in mechanized reasoning, to help people have paths to learn new disciplines, and so on and so forth. That's maybe a more progressive view of what a digital math library ought to be able to do, or indeed any digital library in a modern formulation. But mathematics is somehow special in that the archive of historical documents has lasting relevance to today. And also there's, compared to many other fields, with mathematics you have a rather sharp knife to know whether things are right or wrong, whether they've been interpreted correctly or incorrectly. It's not completely sharp, but it's a lot sharper than in most other areas. And so it's a good place to start for a digital library. And so we set these out as goals. Now, at our joint math meeting presentation session, Tim Gowers, who was here earlier today, had a list of things about what he would hope to see. And I thought that rather than writing down our list of goals, we might take something that he wrote for his talk and paraphrase that. And so the most beautiful contrast in that list is the first thing would be to determine whether or not a result is known, where the answer is hopefully yes, because you want to use that result if it's known. You want to actually use it in the next step to doing something. And the second most important thing is to determine whether a result is known, where the answer is hopefully no, because you think you've discovered something interesting. All right, so those are two very simple initial cases. But then the rest of the things are things that I threw in there: accelerating the advancement of mathematics, accelerating learning, enhancing collaboration, and so on and so forth. Further afield, I'm sure it will come as something, maybe a welcome, lofty, perhaps inachievable goal, but one to work towards the certification of all mathematical knowledge. To be able to act as a mathematical assistant for someone who's practicing mathematics, identification of holes in the existing literature, perhaps generating conjectures. Here are some things, I've seen this, maybe this is always true. And indeed, possibly reflection and refactoring the known mathematics, so that refactoring is a term that's used in software all the time, where you've got a number of programs that together are this big, and then by changing the primitives somewhat and changing the way you do things, now all of a sudden you've got a much shorter program that is more elegant and does the same thing. And well, people are very good at refactoring mathematics, and we do it all the time, and we generalize and we specialize and we redescribe things to our heart's content, but maybe the machine can help us do that too. And in doing that, we are in some sense expanding our human capacity to do mathematics. So okay, these are very lofty and perhaps unachievable, but the main point is to get something done and get something useful. All right, and so I'm going to, I went the wrong way. That's why it looks so familiar. All right, so now when we're talking about these things, we realize that there are different meanings for all the terms that we've used in the slides so far. What does the math literature mean? Well, do we mean the formal literature? Do we mean the informal literature, the gray literature of the archive, or math overflow, or so on? Do we mean research monographs? Do we mean expository work, such as surveys or texts or user guides to proofs, for example? There are specialized collections that are addressing specific topics, such as the digital library of mathematical functions. There's, for example, the Encyclopedia of Continued Fractions, which is a digest of a large number of articles on continued fractions, and so on. So what do we exactly call the literature? Okay, first question. So even if we know what the literature is, we might say, is that really the place where mathematical knowledge is stored? I think that that many people here will feel that there's a lot of mathematical knowledge that is not actually written down anywhere and it's stored in people. because someone says, oh yes, you should, we don't have a proof for that, but we have a proof for something very much like it that's over here, and it's not written down anywhere. You'll never find it by scanning the literature. Well, there's research journals, textbooks and monographs, and the informal literature, as I mentioned. Also, we have article repositories online. Here's an example of some of them quite comprehensive, some of them private, some of them very public. There are various different reviewing services, which when I asked Terry Tao, what would you need as a tool for online collaboration in mathematics? He said, well, really sort of email and MathSciNet. Okay, and maybe a wiki. All right, and so different people. But in some sense, these indexes and reviews and databases are a very important tool. Then, of course, we have general summary works, which when we start to look at the frightening number of articles and the wild generalizations, having some points where people have made summaries can act as a very useful sort of guiding tool for exactly where we want to concentrate. All right, and then there are a number of specialized tools and databases, for example, the online encyclopedia integer sequences. I mean, that is a tremendous knowledge repository. The dynamic dictionary of mathematical functions out of INRIA. Then there are a whole raft of these things, the L functions and modular forms database, and catalogs of lattices, and the encyclopedia of triangle centers, and so on and so forth. All right. Accompaniment. Libraries of proofs, as everyone in this room will be familiar with, and software systems that have mathematical knowledge hard-coded into their code, into their logic. So the mathematical knowledge is really very far from just being in the literature, and it goes on and on. All right, so online courses and so on. So we have to recognize it's more than just the literature when we start to get into this. So now, what were the areas that the IMKT, in its initial conception, was going to focus on? The first would be the area of ontologies. For those who have not been sort of working in related areas, when we're talking about ontologies here, we mean vocabularies, so precisely defined vocabularies, that maybe are not quite as precise as what we would see in a definition in a formal mathematical system, but at least to say, well, SIN refers to a ratio of two sides of a triangle, and it has nothing to do with morality, okay, and so on, and so the way we sort of say what are all the various different concepts that are involved, and then various different libraries we can talk about which of these concepts do they relate to. There's the area of formalized mathematics, which is the point of this meeting here. Then there's the area, if we're going from documents to a knowledge base, somehow we actually have to deal with documents. And so then there's a whole area of mathematical document analysis which comes into play. And then if we're ever going to get this done, we're not going to get it done by having 200 people typing as fast as they can. Just not going to happen. And so we have to look at machine assists to getting where we want to go. All right, so the seed projects of the IMKT were essentially to explore a little bit one thing in each of these areas, recognizing that there has been, in many cases, a great deal of work in some of these areas, and so we would be looking to build on that in those cases. The first would be a concordance of vocabularies of special functions. So by these I would mean, say, trig functions, Bessel functions, Legendre, hypergeometrics, and so on and so forth. And we might say, well, of course, those are all well known. What do you need? Why do you need a vocabulary of special functions? Except for the fact that many different software systems will have completely different argument orders or normalization factors, or for example, where the branch cuts ought to lie. And you can't even go so far as to say, we will use the definition according to Abramovitz and Stegan. So, for example, here's an article co-authored with James, who's sitting in the front here, where we have a formal definition of couthness, and we're saying that arc coth needn't be uncouth, and it has to do with how the branch cuts for the arc hyperbolic cotangent move around between various different printings of the same edition of Abramovitz and Stegan, and what one might want to do about that. So you see that one has to be quite careful. Then there are other seed projects. We talked about, so Tom talked about formal abstracts this morning. We had a 2-hour session on this yesterday, at which we had about 20-odd people. And the notion there is to capture the definitions and assertions in some significant part of the literature. Initially, this would be performed by highly trained, highly skilled individuals, and as time goes on, what Tom didn't say was that perhaps this can be done through some form of supervised automation, along the lines of what we saw with Mohan and Esselingham's thesis some time ago. But these things are we anticipate ought to come together. The notion of harmonizing the libraries of among different significant formal mathematics systems, and the area of document analysis, we're doing sort of n-gram analysis on various mathematical corpora to understand that the machine learning that one can do on this will then come in useful in helping with these earlier things. All right, now let's talk about scale. Now, I promised you trees in the abstract, for those who've seen the abstract. This is one organism. It's not a collection of trees. This is Pando, the trembling giant. It's a quaking aspen clone. So it is a single organism with 47,000 trunks, roughly speaking, about 433 square meters of area covered, massing some 6 million kilograms, roughly speaking, and being about 80,000 years old. So for those who've been paying attention to the vast scope and over-ambition that's been articulated here, there should be some clear analogy that we have a large body of knowledge that when you start pulling on one thread, you have to get the whole thing. All right. Nevertheless, people do go in there and they do cut down individual trunks and get something done. And so how can this relate to what we hope to do? All right. So working at scale with mathematics, if we think that we've got about 50 million pages of math on the go, then that means that there, by necessity, there'll need to be many independent efforts working on different parts. There's no way to centralize this. And so the question becomes, how do I relate one clump of activity to another clump of activity, and for different clumps of activity to be able to build on each other? Or even in a single large project, if you've ever tried to supervise more than, say, a dozen or 2 dozen graduate students and postdocs and so on, you realize that you need to decouple their interactions in order. And so I'm sure that there are large libraries where people work on pieces, and then you find out that the world has drifted since this piece was checked out, and now it needs to be reintegrated in some way. And so the protocols of how to deal with linking together different pieces will become important. And now we have not committed here to working with completely formalized mathematics, recognizing that there will be groups who have a different notion of what capturing the knowledge in an article actually means. So for some, it might mean writing down actually a formalized proof of everything that's in there. For others, it might mean just sort of somehow having a nice word salad of what's in there, and being able to find things when you want to look for them. So there'll be, even for those who want to write things down in a somehow a machine marked up form of saying what is it that is precisely said here, there'll be different degrees of formalism. For example, the open math effort will have something that's distinctly less formal than one would have in Calc. And so with these different levels of formalism, we'd been realizing this a long time in the mathematical knowledge management community. Then Mikhail Kolhaza came up with the term flexi-formalism, and so I needed to have a picture of a flexi-formalist for this slide. And so I Googled contortionist in a tuxedo, and this is what I got. Okay, so good search is important. Another compelling reason that we have to anticipate that we'll be having different levels of formalism is that to formalize something completely takes a considerable amount of time. Frakes de Bruijn factor of about 4 at one point. I think you said it's been many years since you've verified this, but you suspect that now that we just try harder things because we can, maybe 4 is just a human limit before people give up. And so maybe it will always be 4. And lastly, there's this saying I'm sure everybody's heard, a little inaccuracy saves a world of explanation. We use it when we teach our first year calculus classes all the time. It actually comes from a story by this man, Saki, H.H. Munro, and the point here is he's saying that, so he's got a bunch of, well, in any case, that most of these terms are probably wrong in this explanation, but sometimes a little inaccuracy saves tons of explanation. And I think that will be true when if we want to make like increasingly accurate passes over, we're not going to go necessarily from a collection of page images to a completely crystallinely beautiful formalized mathematics for the entire world, but there'll need to be some rough sorting to begin with and so on, and in that there'll be some inaccuracy. So let's turn now to the point of view of document analysis, or the point of view of documents. To begin with, when these areas started to be discussed, there were people from the publishers, from MathSciNet, from Central Blatt, and for these individuals, what is a document? Well, there's all the metadata about where it was published and who the authors were and what was the title and what were the subject classifications. And by the way, there's also this insignificant thing called the article. All right, and so that's one point of view. But then also there is so in the text of the article, how do we go about extracting what is in there? All right. So there's that set of issues. Another is when you've got whole collections of documents. Let's say they're the entire series from a journal, or all of the journals from one particular publisher, or a book series, or so on. Or let's say sequences of conference proceedings, or collections that relate to one specific area, and so on. How do you organize these large collections? That's certainly not best done as one flat space. All right, so how do we get knowledge out of documents? Well, one way, of course, we would need to assemble our document collections, capture the page sets, both the born digital documents and the scanned page sets, because even if something's born digital doesn't mean that you have access to its content directly. Of course, we won't have to capture the metadata, index them, link them, and so on and so forth. But then there's the semantic capture of what is inside the document. And so a nice analogy to how you capture the semantics of what's inside documents is similar to what you would see in the world of compilation. In the world of compilation, you write your program and you send it off to a software tool that first takes the individual characters and assembles them into lexemes, that then assembles them into some parse tree, and then looks at the parse tree and draws conclusions about it and puts annotations on different parts of the parse tree. And then at some point you have enough information there that you can do this rotation, where now the information that you've deduced becomes the primary object, and then the source of the program becomes the secondary object. And then one looks at this now new primary object, and one can generate code from this, and then from the generated code one can do optimization and so on and so forth. So we can think of document analysis in much the same way, that we start off with something which is really quite at a very low semantic level, it's very atomic, and then we somehow assemble it into higher and higher semantic levels, and then once we've got that, then the original bitmaps of the pages become unimportant. So there are, of course, entire conference series on document analysis. The money was initially, of course, in handwritten check scanning and scanning envelopes that would go through the mail. But there was the occasional article on mathematical document analysis, and I've worked in that area to some degree. And you see the kinds of things that one would do would be to sort of identify what was the image, what were the columns of text, and what were the titles, and so on. And there's a fellow, Suzuki in Japan, whose system Infinity has been, he has a lot of specialized rules for how do you spot theorems and how do you spot definitions and so on and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that people do in this area. Having the documents born digital does not relieve us of the responsibility to actually somehow go in and parse the document from its set of symbols on the page. We've seen bad tech everywhere where we might have the opening brace for a set in one piece of mathematics and a closing brace in another piece of mathematics. If you've never seen this, you've never edited a conference proceeding. And of course, some very diligent people will use special macros to carry the semantics of what's going on. So there's two extremes there. But we also have to face a number of issues also. For example, over time, the meanings of basic concepts changes. So for example, the word equation was introduced into the English language by Chaucer. Robert Record later introduced the equal sign, and then later on we had the notion of variables introduced into our practice of mathematics. And so it turns out that in some languages, some human languages, then equations must have variables, and in other human languages, equations may or may not have variables. And so when you're having a conversation with a colleague, you have to be careful. If you are expecting your colleague to be a computer system trying to formalize a piece of mathematics, we have to understand exactly what we mean. So, and actually, whether something is an equation or not in certain languages is actually undecidable. All right, the same notation, we might have different notations to mean the same thing. So for example, here, we saw a nice example of this in Larry's talk with the same notation being used for inverse functions and powers and so on. We might have the same thing the same notation being used for different things. So here we have like a Bessel function might be an angular momentum, might be force current, and so on, depending on what the area is. And then there's issues of language design for the semantic capture. In some of the participants in these activities, language design is one big monolithic chunk of work where the basic elements of the language, like if statements and type declarations and so on, are mixed in with specifications for definitions of functions and Hilbert spaces and whatever, and there's no distinction between some very primitive ideas and some very complex ideas. For others, there'll be a very crisp definition of a small core language, and then other things will be added as components or libraries. There's a large body of knowledge in the area of so-called ontology engineering. You can imagine that, for example, in the area of medicine, there's this classification of infectious diseases where there'll be various different ontologies that are used, for example, for physicians around the world to say exactly, it is a broken tibia in the left leg, in the bottom half or in the top half, and these will have different codes. And these are used actually in some countries for doing medical billing. And so you can understand that when there's a lot of money involved, for example, in the practice of medicine in the United States, that it rather matters how people treat these ontologies, and the way ontologies are dealt with has come under a lot of scrutiny, and we can learn and build on that rather than just saying, oh, we'll just whip up a namespace and have a few primitives, that we can actually make good use of that knowledge. And of course, there's the whole notion of library design that's come from the software world, where we have libraries consisting of hundreds of millions of lines of code that all have to work together. So, all right. An example of something I might consider to be a core language issue would be in this program here where I've defined x to be 1, and then I've got a function with another function inside it. What does this x refer to? Does f of 2 give 1 or 2? That would be an issue in language design, okay? And deciding whether or not to spell hypergeometric with a capital H is at a different level of language design. Nonetheless, it's an important question. All right, and so then there's various different meanings for semantic capture, of course, with, we've got everything from the library science, document analysis, what we might call shallow capture, doing natural language processing of the sentences, to doing a deep capture of the formalized mathematics that's in there. And so, and then, of course, once you were looking not just at individual articles, but then at collections of articles, then there's a synthesis of linking these things together, sort of having sort of multi-item integration rather than just integration of what's in the single article. Okay, so In the interest of time, I'm just going to gloss over these things a bit. What does semantic capture mean? It can be different for different people. Something from just capturing the definitions to everything down to the definitions, the statements, the proofs, and the commentary. One of the things that we have to take into account is that a large part of the literature is wrong. Remember Hilbert from the last talk that we can have a significant part of what is published is wrong. And so if we're saying we're going to capture the mathematical literature as it exists, then that's different than going back and rewriting the mathematical literature to be correct. And so that impacts how we design our knowledge capture. We have to be able to say things that are wrong if we're going to be able to capture what was said. All right. So now I come to the masses. All right. So here we have, this is a bit of a joke. These are not actually the world meetings of the Esperanto Association and Francophonie, but it's a first approximation. All right. That if we had concerns about developing 32 different dictionaries for different ideologies in the Esperanto Association, we would never come up with even one dictionary. All right, we need a critical mass of people to be able to work together in order to get something significant done. And so let's look here at the scope of what we might be trying to do. So here, coming back to F abstracts, so here is the set of published mathematics, this red circle. And this blue circle is a set of true statements. Now we see that a lot of true statements haven't been published, and some published claims are wrong. And so if we're now going to do something in the F abstracts world, and we're going to identify and make some definitions and the claims, well, indeed, F abstracts, which is magenta here, we will need to capture and state some things that are wrong. And hopefully most of what we state will be in the true statement circle, but we have to accept, really embrace, that much of what we're going to be capturing is incorrect, and that we're going to have to deal with it downstream. And then the world of formalized math, actually, we all hope, lives completely inside the blue circle. All right, so there we go. This is a little bit of a roadmap. Now, let's look at one group's work. Let's imagine that the blue things are definitions and the red things are theorems. All right, and this is a group that has formalized some piece of mathematics. This is a nice group's work. Then we go on to the world where there are several groups working. And so here is what my impression of the way things look today, is that we have the orange group, the blue group, and the green group, and the red group. And if the orange group wants to use some theorems that have been proven by the blue group, then we sort of pound include that into our system through some translation process by hand or otherwise, or we go through a very painful process like Tom was describing of exporting and importing stuff. But basically, the number of times I've heard people say, well, we need to take that library and then bring it into System X. That's what this picture is intending to represent as a common practice today. So as an alternative, what we might hope to do then is instead not be doing the inclusions, recognizing that all of these red things are theorems and the blue things are definitions. If we're working in the world of formal abstracts as opposed to the world of proof systems, then we can say, well, yes, you've got your kind of arc hyperbolic cotangent, and you've got your kind of arc hyperbolic cotangent. In order for me to be able to use your theorems, I need to write a theorem that relates mine to yours. And so we can have these translation theorems that go back and forth and include those. And then a number of interesting things happen. So searching for bits of information that can be used with each other becomes some kind of a graph algorithm at looking at being able to sort of follow invertible theorems and so on. And we can assemble bits and bobs of various different results that might be relevant to a particular piece. I realize it's very high level and very vague, but hopefully this gives an idea of what we might try to do. So this kind of approach could support some scalable development. And then if we think of, let's say, as we hope would happen, a new group comes into existence who wants to formalize something different. Well, then they don't need to start from scratch. They only need to relate their notion of an ordered pair, their notion of a real number, and their notion of some basic entities to some other system, then they're attached to the graph. They might have theorems that relate to a couple of other systems, but they don't need to relate to all other systems. So, as I mentioned earlier, this could also be used to give internal structure to large single projects. And then when it comes to the formal harmony, once we've got these identifications of concepts, then as Larry was pointing out, rather than boiling things down to subatomic particles and then looking to see how to reconstruct things, then if you have theorems that relate things in different systems, then you've got, you've got at least at the F abstracts layer, you've got something you can work with. Okay, so then there are some slightly less obvious things about getting things done. We can only afford to hand annotate a small subset of what we've got. And so we need to somehow jump into the air and hope that the train is there when we land. It takes a little bit of courage, but we can formalize. We can actually do F abstracts for a small portion of the literature by hand. A next step would be supervised automation, where, for example, we use something like Suzuki's tool to pull out the theorems and the definitions, even to at least have a textual collection of these things, and then to look at some, for example, like with Mohan's work, to sort of do some assisted interpretation of what these kinds of things mean, and then later get to a stage where we might be able to do sort of automation followed by checking as opposed. Now that's a very, very big step. We have to sort of think far down, if we're eventually going to get there, what would be some of the necessary things that we ought to try to do to be able to get there? Because certainly taking 200 people typing as fast as they can is not going to do it. The amount of mathematics that's being created is more than in a given day than we can formalize in a day. And so will we ever get to the point of full automation? I believe the answer is yes, but the variable then is when, whether it's in certainly not just a handful of years, perhaps a handful of decades. All right, I want to come back to the notion that approximation goes a long way. And so in order to scale, I believe it will be necessary to admit the notion of a flexible notion of formalism in order to do a coarse sorting of things, in order to at least sort out what parts different groups are interested in working on, and to recognize that different groups will be working at levels of formalism that you just don't accept. That some will be saying your level of formalism is too narrow, others will be saying you're completely meaningless what you're doing, but nonetheless we ought to be able to have something which is more precise being used by something which is less precise. And so their entire, immediately images spring to mind about how one might manage that kind of process of a chain only being as formal as its least formal link. All right, of course we will need to be future-proofing the data, because an effort like this will be going on for many, many years. So potential areas for IMKT support, of course, supporting existing collaborations between groups that are currently working with others, but primarily working on their own. One area that can be of use is this notion of mathematical object identifiers. If we do have projects that are absorbing huge sets of mathematical literature with some OCR, then we can at least identify, what are the object of discourse. Even if we don't really know what they are, we can at least identify that they exist, and to be able to say, so then one goes to formalize, say, well, I am formalizing this notion that is this math object identifier. So, understand it's from this article in this journal at this date, on the, and so on and so forth. Proof repositories already exist, but to then have a proof repository that then correlates things with the math object identifiers, and then one can have multiple proofs for the same thing at different levels of formalism, for example, and you might not accept something at level 2 as being a proof. You might only accept things at level 5 as being a proof, but somebody else might be very happy with level 0, which is just a hand-waving argument. And at the end of the day, what we hope to get to are the provision of web services. So some conclusions here, that we have it's really a grand challenge, maybe an overly grand challenge, but certainly a grand challenge to extract and mechanize the world's mathematical knowledge. Formalized mathematics is a big part of this, but it's not the only part of this. The mathematical knowledge management tools become useful and indeed necessary when dealing with large corpora. And that's a typo, large corpora. And this seems to be almost within reach. Certainly parts of it are definitely within reach. And I'm now going to have to delete this PDF off of this computer because of that typo. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you. So that's a pretty substantial shopping list. So, is there a roadmap for how you might get there? And maybe there are kind of business opportunities for people in this, startup opportunities and things like that. And is there any way those of us here can help?
Well, thank you for the question. So first of all, I would sort of point out that we had this very interesting project in Waterloo back in the 80s for digitizing the Oxford English Dictionary, which at the time was an impossibly vast undertaking. And now it seems kind of sort of quite quaint in its scope. But this led to the creation of OpenText, which is now the largest Canadian software company. And they do things like, for example, with the Boston Marathon explosion, the data analysis that was used to correlate all the different photographs from the day and so on, that was done by OpenText. So there are certainly going to be spin-off opportunities here. The initial grant from the Sloan Foundation is modest. It's in the 6 figures, not in the high 6 figures, in the 6 figures, which is really just enough to get the ball rolling. So of course we're looking at future funding opportunities, and the initial seed projects that we described are really very modest compared to the long-term picture the long-term picture is more about setting a direction rather than a precise roadmap to get there. So
sorry. I have a question which is only a little bit related to what you're talking about. You were talking that in the way back there was a lot of discussion about copyright in tables.
right.
And that for me is the main problem with this kind of enterprise. So I wonder what the current state of that discussion is.
So the current state of the discussion is, well, we actually had a very interesting participation from someone from Springer in our joint math meeting session, who was 80% on board. It seems that most publishers are willing to allow open access to articles that are beyond a certain time horizon. That's not a completely satisfying answer. For those of us who happen to have good library access at our institutions, then it's less of an issue, but it goes against the initial intentions of the GDML effort. But one can, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of thing, that one could imagine that one has, when things are really rolling, that there are some things that are still in copyright that nonetheless sort of entered the knowledge base because the elements in the knowledge base are not subject to the copyright, because the copyright covers the form of the presentation and not the actual statements, semantics.
What should I think of? 10 years?
So I think that we've heard different publishers saying 5 years, a number that can be counted on 1 or 2 hands is the kind of, James.
I was going to say, in that respect, we have the great advantage in that maths is, in terms of the big publishers, maths is a small subject. And since most other subjects do not have the same long view of literature that we are actually fortunately piggybacking on the short sightedness of other subjects here. So if I was a pure math commercial publisher, I'd be bankrupt apart from that. So if I was only publishing mathematics and making money out of it, I'd probably want a longer horizon. But because these firms publish other subjects with much shorter horizons, in fact we win here.
Well, and indeed, the Google has very little interest in math because even though it's somehow their core business in terms of getting things done, in terms of what is searched and what is indexed, it's a minuscule fraction. One could easily imagine getting funding from such a company because this sort of doesn't matter economically to them, and yet the technology ultimately will be like a first piece of something that will be possibly of great utility. So already we have the Google Books project that scanned entire libraries of books, as you're well aware, books that are in copyright, and so there's no aversion to working with. So I think that we're not going to be able to change the whole world, but we can certainly, I would expect that we'll need to work with publishers to have access to their copyright material in order to extract the juice, and then we can make the we can make the drinks, but we just can't have the actual article. We just have and what would be the motivation? Well, we've talked about this ad infinitum in our committee meetings, but relevance and the citations that journals attract are based on how used the results are, and so if something's available in a knowledge base before the actual articles are copyright, then that's a commercial advantage.
Are you seeing interest from people from other fields, perhaps like physics or business or?
So we haven't. I've had some discussions with LexisNexis, the legal abstracting service, and with Thomson Reuters, but just at a very, very casual level, and it's all very, oh yes, that's very interesting, please do come talk to us. But I would expect that when we're further down the road, we'd have a very compelling story to tell.
Okay, Arnold, and then you.
How does the project support applied mathematics in adjacent areas or for adjacent areas? Like mathematical physics or theoretical chemistry or biology?
Right. So where does mathematics stop and non-mathematics begin? That's a fantastic question. To some of us, mathematics never stops. Okay, it's the whole world. But I think that for example, if you look at the archive and the number of papers that are published in the physics section, that was initially, and perhaps still is, the largest part. If we have a view to ultimate formalization, then I think we need to stick to a certain kind of mathematics. But in terms of the more flexible formulas, the more flexible semantic capture, then that could be very broadly applied to application areas that use mathematics, and then can indeed refer back to the more fully formalized areas as well as to the less formalized areas. That's a very good point you make.
Thank you. I'm listening
Please introduce yourself.
Sorry?
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Ted Harding. I used to be a lecturer here. I'm interested in the context of your work on this project of how it would try to deal with issues of style in writing and mathematics. If one starts at one extreme, one can have books like J. Littlewood's Mathematician's Miscellany, or Adamow's The Psychology of Invention in the Mathematical Field, which are both fascinating reads, but there's nothing, as it were, no formal structure to it. At the other extreme, you have the sort of modern slot-based paper imposed by the editorial boards of journals, and the writers then have to try and fit their work into the slots. There are all sorts of questions of this kind, but one of the main issues is that depending upon the style in which it is written, a human reader may fairly readily extract what he is meant to understand, a machine might find that very difficult.
That's a lovely question, and it's hard to resist the temptation to look very far forward and to even imagine such things as, oh gosh, I can't understand this article the way that it was written. Could you please help me read it by putting it in a better way? But I think that's in the realm of science fiction, but a very nice piece of science fiction it is. So, but let's call this future work.
The other question arising from that is that to the extent that the procedures which you are envisaging appear to require rather rigid formal structure, is this going to impose upon future mathematical communication similar rigid formal structure because people want to get into the database?
Very good. So I hope that I was able to convey that for practical reasons of the different level of formality of different research groups, that there will be varying levels of formality and varying types of structure from right from the beginning, and we may have the exact same body of mathematics that it starts off where we just have a set of page images, and then someone comes and provides a very loosey-goosey and partly incorrect parsing of this into bits and pieces, and then another pass provides something which is actually quite a nice natural language parse of it, but doesn't really sort of do anything formal with the mathematics. And so I would expect that this, if the architecture for collaboration is correct, then we would sort of have a dial a level of formality. And indeed, one of the reasons the main reason for speaking here today with this particular group, and in particular with the F abstracts discussion yesterday, was to solicit from each active research group or each potential user group a representative, a contact for a representative who could then be part of an advisory group to say, well, you're going in the wrong direction, or you're going in exactly the right direction, or please, oh please do this, and I'm willing to help. So I would look forward to receiving many emails from people who would like to offer up either some of their time or some of their students' time to act in this capacity.
So Ursula asked me to remind everyone that you don't have to sit in the first two rows in order to ask a question. I'm willing to entertain one more question from a backbencher. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
So one thing that comes, so Joe Corneli, hi, at University of Edinburgh presently. So it just strikes me that this project has some similarities and some differences with the QED project, which would be familiar to many people here. Very many differences. One of the ones you just said now was formality as the end goal, as opposed to a preconceived, everything's formal from the very beginning issue. But do you have any other comparisons? Because one of the things about that project is that we're still sitting here waiting for QED to happen. Maybe this is the fruition of the QED too. Do you have a compare and contrast in your mind, and specifically, what would keep this thing on the rails? So, like, rather than waiting 20 years to sort of have a QED retrospective of this project, in 5 years, is there a kind of minimum viable product or something you say, yeah, look, we can't necessarily guarantee this full formality in the future, but is there something we can sort of say, in 3 years or maybe 5 years, we'll definitely do this, and that's our first target.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. There are parts that will need to be fully formal and sound out of the gate. But then I think a great what I hope to be a great strength is that we'll be willing to do some things wrong. Because if you have to be doing everything exactly right from the beginning, then your progress is very slow. When I was a professor in France, the analogy I made to my students there between the American style of software development and the French style of software development was that the American style was to get several versions that were just dead wrong out, and then in an iterative process to get something that was more correct. And the French style, as I said to my students, and I apologize to all of my French colleagues in the audience, was to get something that was perfectly correct from the beginning, but was no longer relevant by the time it was done. And so these are both exaggerations, but they're intended to make a point that if one's willing to make some mistakes and then iterate on those for certain kinds of work, then you're able to get some exploration done and some useful results pretty quickly.
So could you just with the other part of the question, like in 3 years, it would be, as opposed to 20 years, it would be nice to have X as a proof of concept.
So that all depends on how much money we get.
Frank, I'm going to end the session because we need to move on. So there's an exciting day of talks planned tomorrow. Andy Pitts will be chairing. So we'll have Steve Audi, Martin Escardo, Florence Brandon, Dan Lecada, and Peter Lefanu Lunsdane speaking tomorrow. So with that, let's thank Professor Watt for